This is a special evening because we've invited Professor Ernest Uwazie here, who has a PhD in Justice Studies from Arizona State University, Tempe, Arizona. And he graduated from Harvard Law in Mediation and Negotiation program. He was the chair of Sac State's Criminal Justice Department, and he became faculty in 1991. He served as the intermediate past chair from 2017 to 2023. And since 1996, he has served as the founder and the director of the Center for African Peace and Conflict Resolution. He's a world-renowned ADR trainer. That's the Alternative Dispute Resolution and Mediator Training. And he has done all that in the U.S. and abroad. He received the Lifelong Achievement Award this year for the Livingston Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, and he was in 2010 the Outstanding Scholarly Judge Warren Knight Awards of JAMS Foundation, and in 2017 the College of Health and Human Services gave him the Outstanding Faculty Award for Community Service. So I thought that our Sacramento Historical Society members and friends should hear him come and talk. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ernest Uwazie.
My passion is in the area of peace and conflict resolution, and of course in working in communities of people of African diaspora, African communities. So at the university, as Tony kindly introduced, I direct the Center for African Peace and Conflict Resolution at California State University, Sacramento. It's a conference every year. It's a center that every year engages in conferences bringing on peace and conflict resolution, whether it's international as far as Africa is concerned, or even the African diaspora communities in the United States, including Sacramento. And through that organization, we've hosted, I think we've brought Africa to Sacramento, I would say. Having brought the former president, talking about history, the former president of Zambia, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, in 1995, a freedom fighter, the first independent president of Zambia, led the fight against the British for independence. We've hosted Mrs. Winnie Mandela of South Africa, 1997. Of course, both are legends, people that have done great work, have moved on since then. Then in 2005, we hosted the current president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, also on our campus. And 2018, we hosted the president of Ghana, the current president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo. We've also hosted the Chief Justice of Ghana. In 2011, the very first female Chief Justice of Ghana, Georgina Woods. And just last month, we hosted the third female Chief Justice of Ghana, Gertrude Torkornoo. At the end of our conference, we usually have a Peace Awards where we recognize people that have done work in promoting peace and conflict resolution locally, nationally, and internationally. In the Sacramento community, a few years back, we formed the Africa House Sacramento. It's an organization that is a nonprofit organization that's really geared to deal with quite a good number of the issues, especially as it pertains to immigrants, and also trying to bridge the gaps with the pre-arrived, pre-existing generations, if you may. So it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. My understanding, I will speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have a conversation. I really see this as a talk. So oftentimes I really get more from the conversations than what probably I'm able to share with you. So I appreciate you having me here this evening. When I was asked to come up with a title, I said, let's think of a portrait, of African immigrants in the Sacramento area. As an immigrant myself, there is some self-interest, right, to some extent. I immigrated here in the United States in 1982. as a student, undergraduate student at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, where I got my first and second degrees in criminal justice, my bachelor's and master's in criminal justice. Self-financed, in a way, and also having family back in Nigeria to also take care of, being from a single, headed household. My mother, because my father had died in the midst of the Nigeria Civil War when I was 9 years of age. Circumstances pertaining to the Nigeria Civil War. From there, I did something crazy, probably one of the highlights of my life in terms of being crazy, serving in the U.S. Army Reserves. Yeah. Crazy in a good way, right? Because I still believe that every experience that we have in life really kind of prepares you for the next one. It was great. Certainly I was probably the oldest guy at the time, this was 1987, so I would be about 26 years of age at that time, and with a master's degree in the midst of 17, 18, 19-year-olds with high school, right? They made hell out of me in terms of fun out of me with being an old guy with my uppity degree and my accent, all right? But by the time I left, I became a platoon leader. I was teaching them some of my favorite Nigerian war songs that we learned during the Nigeria Civil War, to some extent, as a motivation, right, when things were really kind of getting tough. So I really enjoyed it. And it was also good that when I went for my PhD at Arizona State University in 1987, same year after the training, it wasn't bad that they paid for my tuition. All right? Caveat, I am not representing anybody else but myself. I'm not even representing my wife. And this, my views and my perspectives. I believe in honoring people that on whose shoulders we stand, those who continue to keep the lifeline going, the ancestors who paved the way and on whose shoulders we stand today, our brothers and sisters who had to be shipped involuntarily through the transatlantic slave trade. But I'm also very mindful that America, being a land of immigrants, right? Kind of talk about history makers who project the authentic African image and true imaginations. I honor them. I salute our brethren who bear the burden of blackness as black people, as African people, and still do that with grace and grit. We are a people of hope. So in hopes and aspirations of Africans in America have come here for different reasons, conditions, circumstances, especially in the Sacramento area, who continue to bridge the gaps across cultures, communities, and continents, and I would also add countries, including the vision and mission of Africa House Sacramento. Quick activity. As a professor, we always try to engage our audience, right? I promise I'm not going to give you any exams today. What is your image or portrait of Africans in the U.S., particularly in Sacramento, where we are currently? Kind of ponder that question, right? We live, certainly, especially in the political climate we are in currently, there are many perceptions and misperceptions and myths about immigration and immigrants, undocumented or documented. And as a professor of criminal justice, I always ask my students the question in terms of when you think about those that are involved as far as the records are concerned in the criminal justice data. And usually come in with maybe thinking half of the people in our prisons are immigrants and most of them are undocumented. But by the time we go through the data, whether it's the Uniform Crime Report or the self-report studies or the National Crime Victimization Surveys and other supplemental, it was like, oh, wow. It's less than 10% by and large, right? Even for the part one offenses, because typically people who come, not necessarily coming to commit crimes, typically, right? They're looking for better lives, typically, and they will go to every extent to stay out of trouble, right? Because once you get into trouble, it undermines the whole basis for crossing the borders, legally or illegally, as the case may be. So, but then as it pertains to Africans, again, kind of be honest with yourself, no harm, no judgment. The famous African political scientist Ali Mazrui, whom we had on our campus many, many years ago, talked about Africans of the soil and Africans of the blood. And in that regard, of course, when we talk about that in my own context here, I'm looking at it in terms of those post-slavery. When we talk about Africans, we can talk about Nigerian Africans, we can talk about Sacramento Africans, right, and or quote African Americans to some extent. And of course, the regions, and I don't say sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, Middle Africa, West, East, North and South, and maybe Middle. Sometimes it gets a little bit confusing because for many, many years, the US Census, if you are from, quote, North Africa, you can check the Caucasian bloc or white bloc. You know what I mean? Yeah, until 2020 when they say you can do more than that. But even currently, you can still do that, and legitimately, right? You know, to some extent. That means if you're from Egypt or Algeria or Morocco, and I said, the last time I checked, those are still part of the continent, right? So, but it's somewhat one of those political jigsaw, so to say, if you may. But you know, but we're talking about 54 nation states, about 1.2 million, right, and growing, second largest continent in the world. But for the purpose of our conversations today, the history of Africans, many or most people will start from 1619, right? You know, slavery. But my focus really looking at it post-slavery, when you've had waves, 1860 to the current. Following many of the patterns of European or Western adventures, where many of the missionaries brought back, encouraged, supported Africans coming to the United States, with the hope that not only would they come and learn mostly Christianity and go back and establish those, the churches and the missionary project in those African countries, and some did, but some stayed. And of course, staying means you become part of the community, part of the culture, part of society. You get married, you have family, and so on and so forth, right? Then the 1960s, again, as many of the African countries were becoming independent, certainly we had quite a good number of them going to Europe, especially Britain and France. But you began to see a kind of a sense of interest in the United States. Basically, a kind of new kind of frontier. It was interesting, was exciting, and also was somewhat much more welcoming than some of the European colonizers of Africa. So it was kind of another way, interesting place or region for the Africans to come to. And after their studies as students, like myself, stayed behind. Oftentimes because when you get that degree, and especially if you have the student loan, you have to pay the student loan out, right? And it means you have to have a job to be able to do that. For quite a good number of us, going back to, say, in this case, Nigeria, you wouldn't have as much of the opportunity. The 1960s, 70s, we began to see what they call the stowaways, as of course more interactions, shipping lines and so on and so forth, and other means of transportation, and people basically managed to get it, especially mostly through ships, cargoes, basically. Can I point out the 1996 film, Deadly Voyage, a story around Mr. Ofosu, Ghana, who basically managed to become a stowaway and Several, when they were discovered by the ship owners at sea, some of them were killed, but he managed to survive until getting to New York and was able to escape. So especially in the areas in New York City and New Orleans, we begin to see quite a good number of African stowaways, as the case may be. The 1980s, the U.S., through one of its many acts, especially the Refugee Act, provided opportunity for Africans to come, especially those who are fleeing civil wars and other kinds of persecutions and economic hardship, to the United States. By the 1990s, that was actually the Immigration Act of 1990 under Bill Clinton that took effect in 1995. Generally, this was a bill to allow those countries with low populations in the United States to come in greater numbers. There's a quota each country, depending on the size of the population here. And believe it or not, it was intentionally to increase the rate of Irish populations. Yes, 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 yes. But of course, like anything else, it's like, how about me, right? So before you know it, and then eventually Congress, as normally would, Africa benefited a lot. And actually accounts for about 10% of that population. It's basically, you put in your name, you're basically, as you meet certain criteria, education is one of them. You have to have at least a high school diploma. And then the country would have a certain quota, let's say, I think Africa at some point like 50,000. And then once your name in the lottery comes out and you won the lottery, it's called diversity lottery visa. You go for the interview, you pay the fees, and if you succeed, you get the papers to come to the United States. Over a period of time, once a particular country has reached its own quota, it would no longer be eligible for that. And about the 2000, especially the explosion of the IT field, we began to see quite a good number of Africans coming in for employment in specialized, highly technical, specialized field. I think Microsoft, for example, is a major leader, right, in this regard. In fact, they do have, I think, about 5 offices in different regions in the continent to some extent, including Nigeria. Let's look at some statistics as part of the portrait. The circumstances of your immigration or coming to the United States would shape your socialization experiences or interactions, right? That's very, very important. If you look at the commentaries with the US 2020 US Census, for California and even Sacramento, is that black folks are undercounted for a variety of reasons. Take approximately 2.3 million, according to the 2020 US Census. Add another 2 million or so of the diaspora, meaning people like my children. 70% of them approximately are from West and East Africa. About 55% males, 45% females. About 53% under age 45 years of age. You will find most of them in the Northeast, like New York, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and the South, like Texas. California has about 10% of that. Approximately 55% of those who were sponsored by family or immediate relatives to come to the United States. About 70% of this number we're talking about entered since 2000. About 260,000 would be, quote, undocumented. And when I say undocumented, mostly will be people that came in legally but overstayed, most of them. And we have had some of those people bussed from Texas to California, to Sacramento, Africans. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, about 3,300 of them. 56% of them are naturalized U.S. citizens, like myself. About $58,000, the median income for the African immigrants, compared to $64,000 for all immigrants. They constitute about 17% out of the versus 14% of other immigrants under the poverty level of 25,000 and some change. 42% of those 25 years and above have a bachelor's degree or higher, versus 33% of other immigrants or the US-born population. In fact, if you look at a country like Nigeria, you probably have about 89% of them with a graduate degree, a bachelor's or a graduate degree. 76% are employed in the civilian labor force, management, business, science, the arts, sales, service offices, production, transportation. and 16% uninsured. About 40 billion spending power. In 2018, total remittances of Africans in the US, I'm not talking about the whole world, 48 billion. Went down a little bit in 2020. So quickly, let's look at the Sacramento area. So I'm going to give you kind of the national portrait. About 30,000 African immigrants in the greater Sacramento area. Sorry for my Nigerian brethren that there are more Ethiopians in the Sacramento area than you have Nigerians. Just in the Nigerian community, you will identify at least a dozen churches or faith groups, Christian mostly. The Ethiopians, within that, you can identify at least 5, right, churches to some extent. They're mostly Christians. You do have definitely a significant population of Muslims. And when I say Christians, you would have, of course, in the quote, traditional Episcopal Anglican, in addition to the Pentecostal Christian religious groups. Mostly married to one wife and one husband, and with children. Right? And they are very active voters. They tend to be culturally conservative, but liberal on the fiscal and social side. And part of that is we are much more into community, collective interest than individual rights or individual interests. We kind of believe that it's not a matter of going fast, but going far. If you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go with the group. What is the population of people without markets and stores, right? That's part of the economy, the $40 billion I was talking about before. The African marketplace on Florin Road, if you go in there, of course, there are offices, this large building complex, but you have quite a good number of African artifacts, clothes and body ingredients and food, of course. The Sojourner Truth African Heritage Museum, which is located at the African Marketplace on Florin Road. I've gone a wonderful tour. If you haven't done that, I would encourage you to take a tour there, looking at especially the migration of Africans into the United States. And one of the favorite things there is looking at the wall of famous people, the artwork there. Very historical. It's very, 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 very powerful. Out in here, the Majesty African Marketplace, we can get some, good food in addition to some clothing, as well as food items. Usol is probably the largest of the African market. In fact, it's a wholesale. Many of the African food stores tend to buy from him. And he has farms in Africa as well. So it's quite, and I would say he's a major donor to the Center for African Peace and Conflict Resolution. So this is Red Star International Groceries. If you go in and look at the people who are running the stores who are Asian Americans, you will say, wow, is that Africa? But actually, if you go in, they actually sell African foods. And also very supportive in terms of their philanthropic engagement in the community. One of my favorite places to dine, the Queen Sheba restaurant, the Ethiopian restaurant on Broadway. Good place, yes. And I've not gone to this particular one, but the Yelp reviews seem to suggest it's good. Abyssinia, have not gone to this one yet, but I hope to do that. I understand it's good as well. Restaurant, it's on Fulton, thereabout. I've gone to this place, one of my favorite places. They're mostly West African food. And if you go ask for jollof rice, ask them whether it's the Ghanaian jollof rice or the Nigerian jollof rice. That's a fight you don't want to get into. Just ask for jollof rice. What are some of the contemporary issues, right? As a family, trying to build a family and having to deal and navigate some of the cross-cultural issues and make those adjustments is real. Whether it's in the area of marriage, right? Sometimes we think, I knew what marriage was like between my mother and my father, right? And God forbid, if it happens to be the wrong image of what the husband should be and what the wife should be, it can put you on a very bad place, right? So marriage and divorce, where you have, almost like 50%, right? Marriage result in divorce to some extent in the United States. Unfortunately, we need to see that kind of creeping up within the African immigrant, community. It's a concern because that's really part of the resiliency of the community we're talking about, right? Child rearing also, right? Always that growing up is like, spread the rod and do what? Spoil the child. You know what I'm talking about? But here it's called child abuse if you're not careful. So it's a challenge. It's quite a challenge. And I think that also partly accounts for a high rate child rearing practices that may run afoul of the law for the high rate of CPS records involving, black folks or people of color to a large extent. Language, um, in a household, it may be the native language, Igbo language, for example, in our household to speak to the kids and you want them to learn and so on and so forth, because it can be quite multilingual. But when they go to school, right, that becomes quite a challenge to maintain that. Some of them want to keep the name, right, because we believe there's a meaning in the name, all right? And if they go to school and it's like, that's a funny name, right? And of course, kids can be quite mean sometimes, right? Their peers making fun of their names that could cause them to kind of shrink from that and not want to be identified with their names, even though that's really meaningful. That's really part of that identity to some extent. Kind of struggle with those. The kind of overall American socialization about freedom and rights and so on and so forth that for some people may seem either going too far and sometimes can go afoul, or it become almost like you are spoiling the child, right, to some extent. And then having to maintain the home ties here and there, okay? And it's part of that identity that we're talking about. Youth development, in a way, kind of related to the point I made earlier on. Every generation would want their children, every parent would want their child or their children to do better than themselves, right? I cannot tell my kids this. I did my first degree in 2.5 years. And I did well. I mean, I did fairly well. So sharing this with my kids, my daughter initially thought she was going to beat me. She graduated last week from Fresno State University with BA in psychology and a minor in criminology, and now planning to go to Georgia State for her master's. She said, "Dad, I'm gonna beat you." She tried. Racial discrimination is real. Black folks is real. It's kind of lingering kind of issue that in this country we kind of struggle with. I think some of us tend to deal with it a little bit better than others. We're talking about in the area of employment, or housing, or healthcare, or police. As a professor of criminal justice, right? Police-citizen interactions, right? Is certainly a concern. Thank you. LGBTQ, very sensitive, very delicate. I talked about before, the Africans generally are what? Conservative, culturally speaking, but much more liberal on a fiscal, kind of social kind of side. I think if generally kind of the black community, a little bit of, challenge accepting, condoning, approving LGBTQ rights and some level of difficulty to some extent. It's very controversial. Whether it's on religious grounds, we're really very deeply religious, faith, drawing from that, or culturally speaking, where for especially in the African cultural continent, it's like a taboo, right? Whether one looks at it in terms of looking at this impact on procreation, population, the community, or looking at it in terms of, quote, receiving kind of special treatment or attention, to all rights as a protected group to some extent, maybe have some political dimensions to that, or some may see this as kind of Western, bad Western influence or influences to some extent. Okay? That may be kind of driving some of the controversies around the LGBTQ kind of issue. So you have quite a good number of, many of the African countries would have, be where the United States was until 2012, when the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court said same-sex marriage was okay, right? I think it was 2012, correct me if I'm wrong. So it's fairly recent to a large extent, if you kind of think about that. Even with that, even the United States is still heavily contested, very heavily contested, right? At national, state, levels. So this is definitely one of the contemporary issues looking at U.S.-Africa relations. President Obama, for example, when he was in office, and this was probably a very turning point of tension or relationship with many of the African leaders, he conditioned quite a good number of the U.S. policies toward Africa in the area of their improvement in terms of LGBTQ laws and policies and programs to some extent. There was quite some pushback. And so you're actually beginning to see some African countries now. I'm not saying necessarily was because of that per se, but definitely it did have some genesis. Going back and actually enacting some very draconian laws. Uganda, for example, passed probably one of the strictest, not a law, a bill, which has been challenged, now pending in the court. Many of those things certainly reverberate in terms of the African diaspora communities and groups. Either don't want to talk about that because you're not quite sure who you're going to offend, or sometimes may really out in your face that you are going to hell by, right, supporting, engaging. And sometimes it kind of comes down in many instances, and this is where my own work in terms of conflict resolution comes down to personal decisions and family relations. Working with family members who said, my daughter or my son is X, Y, or Z, right? And I don't quite, I cannot, there are people that have actually disowned their children, families that have actually been split apart because of it, right? And then have kind of come back and saying, knowing what you know now, which one is more important for you? It's going to come down to that particular personal, however difficult decision it is, right? Kind of reminded me of a time, even along the religious, even Christian religions, where I'm not going to come to your wedding because you're marrying somebody who is not from the same really Christian faith, right? I mean, I've seen families torn apart because of that, okay? So it's one of those things that my rule, I do work on restorative justice and always talk about do no harm. And any law that causes harm to the population for which it's intended to protect, for me, means that law is not doing what it should be doing. For me, that's kind of do no harm, restorative justice type of angle. I think I said, these are my views, my perspectives, and not those of my wives or my employer or any other associations. But I kind of felt authentic enough to kind of share those with you. Africa House is engaged in trying to grapple with our mission and vision, many of these issues, as humanely. The things we know that we have to be humble to say there are things we don't quite know. And we make effort to try to know and how to navigate some of these thorny, difficult issues to some extent. And again, it's a matter of how do we create a society that improves the lives and conditions of the next generation. I have been blessed in this society, in this country, in my life as an African man. I think I have an obligation to also use that to bless as many of the future generations as I can. And that's the reasons really those of us started Africa House Sacramento, to have a hub, a place where these narratives can be shared. not just with and by Africans, but also with the larger community, because we don't exist alone. We're as part of the broader community of Ubuntu. I am because you are, therefore we are. Peace. Thank you very much.
I was curious about your view as a young person and as a teenager before you came to the United States. Did that prepare you for how imperfect our democracy is here and all the things that you faced when you arrived?
That's a great question. Yes and no. I came here after my high school, and I was a little bit older because my high school, my education was interrupted because of the Nigerian Civil War. So I finished my high school by age 21 as against, 18, 19, as I guess maybe. Sorry, age 20. Then I came here in 1982, 21 years of age at the time. While in Nigeria, Willie Nelson was my favorite musician. John F. Kennedy was my hero, right? In fact, while in high school, we had an essay we called JFK essay for high school for scholarship. I wrote, competed in such essays. So you have these kinds of, images. Of course, Martin Luther King as human rights activist and so on and so forth. Okay. So it wasn't like came to the United States, I was like, oh, wow, it's much more complex. So when we talk about definitely the image of the United States is kind of land of milk and honey, right? It's basically almost like there's a tree where you can go and just pluck the dollars to some extent, right? Then you come here, it's like, oh, wow, it's a little bit much more than that, to some extent. Willie Nelson still remains my hero. John F. Kennedy still remains an ideal leader for me. And then in fact, while I was working and going to school, as well at the same time, and I worked at a nursing home. And at this particular nursing home in Austin, Texas, one of the people that I took care of was Willie Nelson's mother. So on a couple of occasions, he came in through the back door in the evening time, and a couple of those times, and the first time I was like, whoa. And here he was. So the mother kindly introduced me by saying he's, taking care of her. And he tipped me big time. Not with weed. Yes.
Do you see any difference of racism between those African Americans who've been here for generations and a new immigrant? Is there any difference in what you see?
Yes, from my vantage point, and again, it could vary from individual to individual depending on when and where and how and who, to some extent. Definitely those before me, especially descendants of slavery, right? Undoubtedly had much worse, right? Kind of the history to some extent. And my son at the time, he was 6 years of age. This was the time Barack Obama was running for the presidency during the primaries. I remember that particular summer, actually 5 years of age. I remember that particular summer, we had bought him a suit for to mark his 5-year, right? This young man, he's a very tall guy, he's about 6'4" now. So we bought this nice black jacket for him. So in July of that particular year, he insisted on wearing his suit to go to church. And it was very hot. We worship at St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Elk Grove. At 11 o'clock mass, he said he was going to wear his suit. My wife and I were like, why? Like, what that means was if he wore a suit, I have to also wear one. So I indulged him, and then I said, so he came out and he said, Dad, do I look like a president now? Right? It dawned on me the mentality. So it's not just that kind of the physical kind of ratio, it's real, but how for the black man, especially those of descendants of slavery, kind of gotten into the brain, that was quite revealing for me, right? And probably I would not have had that experience if that had not happened with that for my son. And you can extrapolate from there, right? To some extent.
I was wondering how the radical Islamist movements in some of the countries like Chad or Niger or Mali have been affecting the desire of people wanting to come to the U.S. or even making it possible for them to come.
Yes, of course, it kind of goes back to some of the conversations we have on this side of the U.S. with regard to protective status, at least temporary protective status for those citizens from those countries who may not go back because of the reality of the violence there, or being able to receive them and with less burden as asylees or through the asylum or as refugees, to some extent. There is no doubt that is having, tremendous, impact, in a way. The reality, however, generally is that, and unfortunately, Africa, unfortunately, doesn't register as much in the U.S. foreign policy as it should compared to some other places in the world. And there are probably many reasons people can opine as to why that is the case. Is it because of race or is it because of something else? Many of us were definitely quite disturbed, but in a way, something that was in the open that probably had been going on for some time in the background when the former president referred to, African countries as S-hole nations to some extent, 2018, to some extent. Definitely quite disappointing and damaging in many instances to some extent, and it kind of reflects in terms of the ability of those from those countries to come, like other places, other people from other parts that are facing similar conflicts, or even while here being able to receive the type of protection in terms of the immigration laws with regard to them. So,
I'm a registered nurse for many years in the community, and I've worked with many, many African colleagues, and it's always a pleasure. They're intelligent, great integrity, and I know that's kind of a general statement, but I think they're a joy to work with. Very proud people and very proud of their culture, which shows in their custom-made scrubs. They're very colorful. And my question is, those that are IT professionals back in Africa, is their salary comparable to what they're getting here in Silicon Valley or here in the U.S.?
I'm not as knowledgeable. And by the way, thank you for the kind comments. I hope I did project that image of African portraits, not in terms of the education, but the involvement in terms of the employment and our commitment to family and staying out of trouble, to some extent, as really, and yes, we are very proud of who we are, despite the challenges. You may try to tell us otherwise, we probably wouldn't fall for it, right? like that community and enjoy very strong in our faith. I think it's quite important. I'm not too familiar in terms of the data or statistics, but from my the doctoral information, you do have some of the IT companies in Africa that have employees who are paid in dollars. It may not necessarily mean that it will be the same thing that your counterpart in the US will be getting, but a part of that conversation may be living, the cost of living, right? Depending on where you are. Yeah. And depending on which company and your level, may determine whether you'll be paid in dollars, which is the preferred currency, or in the local currency. In this case, say Nigeria, we paid in naira, for example, right? For some, for some people. But also you do have some of them who are employed by the companies, say Microsoft in Nigeria, but actually their workers are in the United States somewhere doing work for Microsoft in the US, who oftentimes would mean that they will be paid comparable to what their counterparts will be making. So it depends on which company, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Why you chose to come to the United States for your education? I hope that's not an impertinent kind of question, but I'm just curious because, yes, there are some things that you thought about that were positive, but there also were things that you knew were not, and so just...
Yeah, definitely safety was an issue in terms of the earlier question about U.S. and guns, certainly, and violence, certainly. But that certainly wasn't something that was top of my mind to say I'm not coming because it could happen anywhere, right? It could happen anywhere. Frankly, my coming to the United States was not my original plan. It was not at all. I'm blessed it happened. When we say God works in mysterious ways, you may have your own plan. God may also have his own plan, right? I just ride with it, I finished my high school. I did very well. Distinction in terms of the grades, high school. But Nigeria at the time, getting into the university was very competitive. I wanted to study law. But the first admission I got was to study anthropology, sociology at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, one of Nigeria's premier universities. I said, I'm going to wait for another year because I'm not really into sociology, anthropology. I'm going to wait for the law that I really wanted to study. While that year, as I was waiting, preparing for that, my high school classmate, a friend, we happened to be from the same village, was coming to the United States to join the elder brother in Austin, Texas. So he came and he said, "You should come over." I thought it was a joke, right? I was like, so before I know it, I got the admission. I was like, where is the money gonna come from, right? At the time, my mom said, "Go and talk to your elder sister." I have an elder sister, who was working, in one of the cities. Where's she gonna get the money? $5,000 US, 1982. That's quite some change, just for the school fees. Not talk about the flight and. I thought my mom was smoking something. She insisted I should go and talk to my elder sister. So I went and talked to my elder sister. She was more excited. I was like, she must also be smoking something. Before you know it, she was able to use her saved money and then was able to talk to her employer. She was a great employee. Her employer was able to advance her salary for 6 months to be able to make the payment. So before you know it, it happened. I even at the time I was going to the U.S. Embassy, I was, let me just go through the motion. I don't think I'll get the visa, right? But voila.
I've been in places where there was a larger and more identified African immigrant community, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Washington, D.C. And I thought, when I start thinking about African immigrants in Sacramento, I couldn't think of a hub or a place or even a storyline. And so by coming tonight, then you were able to, provide me with that. So thank you for teaching me about that.
Thank you.
And when I listen to you talk about your immigrant experience, it makes me relate to my family's immigrant experience. And, there were people in front of you going, come on, and there were people behind you going, we'll support you. And I think just personally, making that distinction, I think that I can only speak for myself. When I see a black face, I think of that legacy of slavery and African American experience in the U.S., and I don't stop and think, oh, maybe this person is an immigrant who has a completely different set of experiences, and yet there's the commonality. I think of you in the intersection of being not only a black man but an immigrant, and with your accent, probably an obvious immigrant. And then what does that mean in terms of your experience too? So anyway, thank you for coming and sharing. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So, Dr. Uwazie, I have, I was at the university. I remember you from the university. I've been retired since 2016. It's wonderful to see you.
Thank you.
And Tony, and I just barely remember. So, but what I want to say is I started going to church since I've been retired. And so I'm going to the Episcopal Church in Midtown. Yes, and there is a population of Africans there, Senegalese, I think, and I am so obviously Californian, and I'm asking a man this, and I really need to ask the women. How do I talk to the women? They kind of hide behind their husbands, and they dress up more, and they look kind of down on me, and they wonder, what am I doing in some sort of capacity to even try to talk to them? Do you have any suggestions other than me dressing up?
Be yourself. It's thank you, and what's your name? Debbie. Oh. Yes. Thank you. I remember now. Thank you very much. Great pleasure. Great question. Two things. You can step up and do ask. You get a response, whether from the wife or the husband. Okay? There are also quite a good number of them that may have organizations, and welcome them. I'm a very strong member of the Sacramento Association of Nigerians, actually a founding member of the Sacramento Association of Nigerians. And I've had quite a good number of people that have recommended and have joined the organization, have really found it very, very meaningful. Even if just coming in and come to the meeting and just watch how things go. With some of the meetings now are by Zoom, and for a long time it was by Zoom because of the pandemic. But last month we started alternating between. It's monthly, the second Saturday of the month, 3 to 5 p.m. Maybe a bit more than that. That would be certainly. Almost all those organizations would have some cultural events, whether it's independence celebration or some festival. And maybe some of them may be by admission, which usually is anybody can pay and get in, or free. Just use that as a way to kind of learn and the environment and the culture. Trust me, you will be able to make make that inroad to some extent. And of course, I'm always available. One of the things I'm blessed is have access to pretty much all the African community organizations. I think I consider myself to be a kind of cultural broker or navigator. I'd be glad to make that connection for you. You may know that quite a good number of them are married to, quote, Senegalese, married to, quote, Sacramentan Black Americans, right? Akila Hatchett, for example, the husband is from Senegal. Akila, yes, has one of the kinks. I think they have, So you do have quite a good number of those family relationships that exist. One can always kind of tap into. You also do have some people that have done the Ancestry.com DNA and said, oh, wow, I'm Nigerian. Most of the people have come to me and say, I'm Nigerian. And this was before Merkel. Okay, all right. So in addition to Megan, right? And so quite a good number of and kind of get away to kind of, like to make a trip to Nigeria. Quite a good number also to Ghana. Right, I've taken quite a good number of people to Ghana, including my students. So, it's a matter of looking for those points of entry. And trust me, once you're able to make the connection, you will definitely, value that. So, but again, I'd be glad to help broker some of those connections as well. Thanks, Debbie. All right.
So that's going to end our talk tonight. I was going to say that the portrait of an African is you.
Okay.
I want everyone to know that I've known Ernest a very long time, and the Africanness that he gives to his students is something quite unique.